what would be the importance and the involvement of John Cage in the visual art scenes from the 60s and 70s?
But there's no real way to answer that question shortly, because Cage is one of the foundational figures for the development of the arts in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Cage was involved with visual artists already in the 1930s and 40s, but really it's after around 1951-52 that he becomes a generative force for the development of the arts. Cage is not ever really an influence in the arts. He's more of a collaborator with different artists. So Cage is involved with Robert Rauschenberg, with Jasper Johns, and his ideas move through that nexus of people and through his involvement with Merce Cunningham in dance into the wider engagement with artists all the way into the present day, actually. So you can find many artists that are engaged with Cage now almost as much as artists were engaged with Cage in the 1950s and 60s, even though Cage is no longer with us.
And what would you say is the importance of the piece Harpsichord that you talked about from 1969 in Cage's career?
The piece Harpsichord, which is this computer piece Cage did in 1969, restaged in 1972, using what was at that time a very powerful computer, but which is now not a very large thing, is in some ways not really a very important or influential piece by Cage. It's in many ways the end of a certain aspect of Cage's development, and for that reason it's a very interesting as a historical period in Cage's work, where Cage encounters some of the questions and limitations of technology, some of the questions and limitations of his engagement with the visual arts, some of the questions and limitations of his engagement with politics. So Harpsichord is in some ways interesting, not because it's an influential work, that is a work that begins and then has an impact, although it was very important for, say, an artist who's involved in visual arts and film like Anthony McCall. British artist Anthony McCall saw Harpsichord in 1972 in London, and it was a very important work for him, he says. But I think that Harpsichord in some ways is the end or the ultimate development of that period of Cage's work that begins in, say, 1952. So you have a development from 1952 until 1972, 20 years, in which 4 minutes, 33 seconds starts that development, and Harpsichord in some ways ends that development. And then Cage goes on to develop into the 70s a different aesthetic and into the 80s a different aesthetic of his. So I'm interested in it as a very complex and engaging historical document in that sense.
If you could comment a little bit about the idea of the politics and the spectator and the role of the spectator.
Well, the role of politics in Cage is a very difficult and interesting one. The normal discussion of Cage, and the discussion that many people would have of Cage, is that Cage was simply not very political at all. Is that Cage's politics were contradictory, that he spoke about freedom, but he actually wanted to control the way things worked. What I'm interested in is looking at Cage's relationship to politics, which is there in his writings already in the late 30s, but really develops partially because of the force of historical events in the 1960s. Cage proclaims himself an anarchist, or aligned with an anarchist philosophy and politics, in 1960, and he keeps developing that all the way through his life into his interest in Thoreau, for instance, his interest in other political figures. So Harpsichord is a piece that's interesting in some ways because Cage said that it was a political piece. He said it was a piece not about politics, but that somehow created a situation that could be understood as political. And at the same time, it's interesting because younger composers, particularly Cornelius Cardia, who is a composer that was very close to Cage and then breaks with Cage, specifically attacks harpsichord on its political valence. So harpsichord is a work that is interesting, not because it gives us a clear answer, this is what Cage's politics is, but because it's a complex historical moment in Cage's development and in the development of the socio-political world around him in the 1960s. Remember, harpsichord is begun in 67, it's finished in 69. So that means he's composing it right through 1968, right through the student protests, right through Paris, and May 68 in Paris, and all around the world, which Cage knows about and is thinking about. So harpsichord is a piece that is done at this very important historical moment, but that is as contradictory as that moment itself. So it's not something that can be used as a sort of manifesto statement, but it's something that can be interrogated from the social and political aspects as well as the artistic and technological aspects and how those come together in Cage's work. So there's no simple answer to harpsichord, which is why it becomes an interesting thing to study and attempt to engage with.
What would you say is Cage's biggest legacy to arts nowadays, to contemporary art? Maybe there's no answer to that.
I think that Cage, part of the reason Cage is important and will continue to be important is because Cage put on the table a number of things that you could almost call axioms. So if you think about math, there's like an axiom that you take from which you derive a whole bunch of other solutions. And a work like 4 minutes, 33 seconds, a piece in which for that amount of time there is no sound, if you take it seriously, then you can take it in various different ways. You can say you get rid of the composer's expression and you make the work about listening rather than composing. If you look at the score which is written that says tacit, 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 you can say that you move from musical notation to actual just handwriting notation, and we can then write scores in this way. There's a whole lot of different ways that you can take it. And Cage is a figure like Duchamp, where if you take Duchamp's urinal, his piece Fountain, seriously, his ready-made seriously, it opens up a whole bunch of new things that you can do. So Cage gives us the prepared piano, he gives us silence in the way that he understands it, he gives us the use of chance techniques, he gives us indeterminacy, he gives us a whole range of things that different people can go to and get different answers from. And that's why I think he will be a figure that is generative for decades and decades and decades, rather than someone who will be used up. Because part of him will get used up by a generation of artists, and then another part of him will come to the fore, and another generation of artists will move forward. So I think that he, in that sense, is a multiply generative artist, and that's what I think is his ultimate importance, even if I can't pin down one exact thing that would summarize that for him.